tweets at GCR2P, and we will have a recording of the event, which will be shared on our website and social media channels later today. You can, and you're encouraged to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A chat box below, and we will get to them at the end of the event. Now, I do want to highlight that the date of today's event isn't a coincidence. Tomorrow, the UN Human Rights Council will begin deciding on draft resolutions for the 49th session. And many of those are, in fact, renewing or establishing mandates of special rapporteurs or investigative mechanisms, which are documenting atrocity crimes, but which also specifically look at gender dimensions of situations at risk. So today is really meant to elaborate on how we can systematically utilize the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms and procedures to become better at applying a holistic gender lens, and how we can overcome the lack of gender sensitivity within atrocity prevention and response. And we have an absolutely exceptional lineup of panelists to also leave us with very concrete recommendations on how to do so. And it's really an honor to introduce you all to our panelists today. We have with us Shahrazad Akbar, the former chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, Reem Al-Salem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Its Causes and Consequences, Julie Dubé-Gagnon, gender specialist and sexual and gender-based violence investigator at the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, Patricia Sellers, Special Advisor on Slavery Crimes to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and Fellow at Kellogg College, University of Oxford, and Marta Valinas, Chairperson of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Now, before we go into the discussion, I have the great honor to give the floor to our co-hosts, beginning with Her Excellency Leslie Norton, Permanent Representative of Canada in Geneva. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. So welcome and thank you all for attending today's discussion, and of course to Liechtenstein for its support as co-sponsor. Of course, I'd also like to give a big shout out and a special thank you to the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect for its engagement and leadership. Canada welcomes the opportunity for a rich exchange of views today on the R2P and WPS agenda. In Canada, these issues have been at the center of both domestic and international policy. We can now point to a robust national action plan for women, peace and security, a respected WPS ambassador, and a national R2P focal point who facilitates national coordination and promotes international cooperation to strengthen efforts to prevent and respond to atrocity crimes. But today we want to focus in on why, as an international community, we have yet to achieve the systematic application of a gender lens to preventing and responding to atrocity situations. As we know, the UN Human Rights Architecture is designed to provide early warning signs of atrocity crimes, as well as identify situations where women and girls are at particular risk of human rights violations. Geneva plays a unique role in achieving more robust, holistic, and effective atrocity prevention efforts, which recognize the diverse role that women play in prevention and response. 3 years ago, in June 2019, Canada and the Global Center first hosted a full-day conference exploring the linkages between WPS and R2P in Geneva. Today will be an opportunity to build upon those discussions and to provide concrete recommendations to member states on how we can hardwire a gender lens into the mechanisms and procedures we helped create. We also hope to zero in on the limitations of our gender lens. Women are victims of atrocity crimes and are disproportionately affected by sexual violence. That we know. However, they're also experts in accountability, justice, and reconciliation. How to ensure that their global wealth of knowledge and experience does not go untapped in our efforts to address atrocity crimes is really the key question. I look forward to hearing from this great lineup of panelists as they tackle these important issues. Thank you, and back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your remarks. And I do want to thank you for your continuous leadership on R2P and also on enhancing gender-sensitive atrocity prevention measures and really bridging the gap between R2P and WPS. It is a great pleasure to also give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kurt Jäger, Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein in Geneva. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Excellencies, dear distinguished guests, panelists, and colleagues. I feel very comfortable today for once, being the only man on the panel. Often I'm faced with the problems that I have to deny invitations to attend because there are no women present. So Liechtenstein is pleased to co-host this event alongside with the Permanent Mission of Canada and the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect, two very strong partners, I must say, when it comes to the fight against discrimination and violence against women. Liechtenstein is a strong supporter of the Responsibility to Protect, as well as the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So our recent ratification of the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence underscores our commitment to tackling violence against women. Gender-based discrimination and political exclusion, violence against women, sadly, are problems in every society, in every country. But these problems are exacerbated in crisis situations, such as the pandemics and conflicts, making women even more vulnerable and often excluding them from the very solution-finding processes. Armed conflicts bring out the worst in humans. Women are increasingly targeted in armed conflicts, in particular as victims of gender-based violence. To make matters worse, survivors of gender-based violence often face stigmatization and threats, which prevent them from reporting the very crimes they've been subjected to. The lack of accountability can be seen as a silent acceptance of the culture of impunity towards and around gender-based sexual violence. While the UN Human Rights Council has already made great efforts to address these issues, a lot more needs to be done to see concrete change. In order to apply the proper gender lens in council mechanisms, we must learn to look at women not only through the lens of victimhood, but also acknowledge their great potential as agents of change. Some governments are only beginning to integrate gender perspectives into their policies and programs for the implementation of the WPS agenda. Although it has become good practice to do so, not everyone everywhere seems to have internalized it yet. On the other hand, it seems clear that the shifts in political systems throughout the world, including increased authoritarianism and erosion of liberal democratic norms, such as the respect for human rights and gender equality and the rule of law, and increased great power competition, are also having negative consequences for the WPS agenda. I look forward to learning from our panelists today how much progress they believe has been made in this area, and especially what their recommendations are and how best to move forward, keeping gender central to the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council to defend human rights. A special thanks, of course, goes to the Permanent Mission of Canada again and to the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect for organizing today's event, to distinguished panelists, of course, for being here with us and sharing important views and ideas, as well as to all of you guests for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion today, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jäger. And let me also thank you and Liechtenstein for your continuous leadership on advancing R2P, both in Geneva and in New York, and in particular, of course, through ensuring accountability for atrocity crimes. Last but not least, I would like to share a video message from our Executive Director, Ms. Savita Pandey, which I believe we will hear in a second. Yes, wonderful.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Savita Pandey and I am the Executive Director of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. I would like to begin by thanking our co-hosts, the governments of Canada and Liechtenstein, for supporting this event today and for their continued commitment and leadership on R2P across the UN human rights system. The UN Human Rights Council's mechanisms and procedures as critical tools for early warning and accountability serve an important function in the prevention and response to atrocity crimes. As women and girls are often disproportionately affected in atrocity situations, the HRC's mechanisms and procedures also shed light on how they are uniquely targeted. In the past 3 weeks alone, we have received reports from the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, and the report of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, among many others, documenting how gender-based violence constitutes a defining feature across atrocity situations around the world. Their findings underline the need for us to build better linkages between R2P and WPS to ensure more effective prevention and response strategies. However, Syria, Myanmar, South Sudan, and so many other atrocity situations also show us how the gender lens goes beyond documenting sexual and gender-based violence. From Kabul to Juba to Caracas, it is women who are defending human rights, building peace, and often reconciling entire communities. The UN human rights system has yet to systematically integrate a gender lens which goes beyond looking at women as victims. This would mean utilizing HRC's mechanisms and procedures, not only to improve gender-sensitive early warning, but also to recognize and utilize the crucial role of women as leading actors in initiatives to prevent and respond to atrocities and violence. Let us use this discussion today to learn from our distinguished experts on how we can achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Savita as well for these remarks and for highlighting a couple of country situations, which we will be able to discuss hopefully in the course of today's conversation. And I do want to start exactly there by talking about very, very concrete countries where we see the application of a gender lens. So I would like to start with you, Julie, to reflect a bit about that. You have served as a gender specialist and SGBV investigator on multiple investigative mechanisms established by the Human Rights Council, COI in Burundi, Gaza, the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, but also for the mapping report on the Central African Republic, which is actually based on the UN Security Council resolution. So based on this extensive experience, how have different Human Rights Council mechanisms applied a gender lens to their investigations? And then how does the IIM apply that gender lens to its work in Myanmar?
Thanks, Elizabeth, for your question, and it's an honor to be part of this panel. So my perspective today comes from the ground, the field, having spent nearly 7 years conducting investigations for Human Rights Council mandated commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, and mechanisms. For example, in 2017, I was assigned as gender advisor and sexual and gender-based violence investigator to the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi, which was mandated to investigate post-electoral human rights violations amounting to international crimes in Burundi since April 2015. In refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, I spoke to over 50 women and girls who were brutally raped and sexually mutilated by members of pro-government militias or security forces in their homes, often in front of family members, or while they were fleeing because of the perceived political allegiance of their male relatives. They told me their male relatives were arrested, taken away, disappeared, killed, and perpetrators would come back to attack the women and girls with sexual violence. When I met them at the interview location in those refugee camps, some of these women and girls would bring their young children and infants for which we had arranged childcare. But then we later found that some of these children were actually born from the rapes that they had just told me about. I also interviewed a dozen men and boys who were sexually tortured in detention. They told me that their testicles hang with a string attached to water tanks, or they were even forced to rape other men in detention because they were suspected to support political opposition. These men said they no longer felt like men after these experiences. So applying a gender lens in the Burundi investigation allowed us to understand that perpetrators intentionally attacked men and boys through the commission of sexual violence against women and girls, and that men and boys were actually attacked for their gendered roles in their community. But investigating sexual and gender-based violence does not necessarily mean that you apply a gender lens. Gender analysis cannot be subsumed by sexual violence. They're actually two different things. Let me give you another example. In 2018, I was assigned as the gender advisor to the Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, Gaza, which was mandated to investigate killings and injuries perpetrated by Israeli security forces in the context of the right to return protests at the fence every Friday. There was actually no sexual violence here to investigate, but this absence actually underscored the criticality of applying a gender lens. From the outset of the investigation, we noted that men and boys were in 99% of the cases targeted by perpetrators. Where were the women and girls? Didn't they participate in the protests as well? And why? This intrigued us, and we needed to speak to Palestinian women and girls to better understand. In order to do so, We had to set up gender-sensitive methodologies to reach out to them. We couldn't just reach out to Palestinian female witnesses like we reach out to Palestinian male witnesses, and for many reasons, including because of the prevailing patriarchal norms in Gaza. Women often don't have their own smartphones and are not afforded the same space to meet and associate in public. We therefore worked with local grassroots women's organizations where female witnesses would normally go for services and activities. Women and girls were not direct victims of these violations in Gaza, but they were still victims. Women and girls would care for the injured or amputated male relatives. They lost the main breadwinner of the household, or they suddenly also became female-headed households when male relatives were actually killed. That also exposed women to other risks, such as evictions and forced marriages. So pre-existing gender discriminatory practices, such as forced marriages in this case, were exacerbated as a result of this conflict. Applying a gender lens in this investigation enabled us to understand the whole spectrum of victimization and the gender disproportionate impact of violations on women and children. Another example. From 2017 to 2019, I served as a gender specialist and SGBV investigator to the fact-finding mission on Myanmar, mandated to investigate gross human rights violations amounting to crimes in Myanmar since 2011. I was not assigned to the Rohingya plight, but to investigate violations committed against other ethnic minorities. In this case, it was important to speak to other victims than the Rohingya. Obviously, we also did speak to the Rohingya, to compare perpetrator conduct. Did perpetrators use the same scale of sexual violence against other ethnic minorities? I spoke to over 200 victims, survivors of sexual violence, and other witnesses, remotely because we did not have access to Myanmar, also in person in neighboring countries. Women and girls told me they were gang raped during military operations because they were Kachin and suspected to support the armed rebellion, and also because they were women, because they are the keepers of their own culture. I spoke to men and boys who were sexually tortured in detention because they were also suspected of supporting or being part of an opposing armed group based on their ethnicity, but also based on their gender. We amassed so much information on the commission of sexual and gender-based violence that we decided to release a standalone report on SGBV and the gender impacts of these conflicts, which I co-authored. We found that the commission and impunity for gender-based violence in Myanmar was exacerbated by the underlying gender inequality. Those findings were actually instrumental for what followed at the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, for which I'm part of now, the only criminal investigation created by the Human Rights Council so far. The mechanism applies a gender lens and intersectional approach in all phases of its work. We can only conduct criminal investigations that fully reflect victims' harm once we actually understand how gender impacts the way in which victims in Myanmar experience harm, how perpetrators perceive their victims, the meaning of the harms inflicted, and the specific gender dynamics that drive the perpetration of such harm. Perpetrators hit where it hurts. They hit the victim, but also the victim's entire community. And we cannot even pretend to fully grasp the extent of harm or impact on the victim if we do not apply a gender and intersectional lens to our investigations. Applying a gender and intersectional lens enables us to think holistically of what it means to be male or female in Myanmar's diverse society, as well as the cultural, economic, religious, political, sociological factors that shape this understanding. Now, this is the theory. In practice, we've learned from this that gender dynamics are even more important to consider in a post-COVID world, and where most Human Rights Council mandated investigations have no access to the country under investigation. We need to respect survivors' agency to speak to us and report their cases because it's healing for them. But also we need to look at all risks from all dimensions, including from the victim's own eyes, before engaging with them, remotely or in person. Do women or girls need to seek consent from the male head of household before engaging with us? Do they own a smartphone? Do they need a mock reason to leave the house and come speak to us? Gender discrimination permeates everywhere. And these are but just practical examples from the field that we need to consider before engaging with potential witnesses. Here's another example of where we've applied gender lens. The mechanism has looked at gender dynamics entrenched in security forces, but also in non-state armed groups. Myanmar's highly patriarchal society is also reflected on how parties conduct war. Women are rarely afforded combat functions in armed groups, which is required actually to access leadership roles within these groups, eventually leading to a seat at the table to negotiate peace. Women in Myanmar so far have been absent from peace talks. So they participate in the armed struggle through activism, through the household. The mechanism has made significant efforts to engage in dialogue with women's groups, Rohingya women leaders, and women leaders of all ethnicities, LGBTQI groups, to actually understand their struggle, their particular harm, how and why they were subjected to sexual and gender-based violence. Our policies and investigations are informed directly by victims and survivors, by women, girls, boys, LGBTQI persons who would not traditionally have had a voice in such accountability processes. What I've learned, and I'm going to end here, what I've learned from all of this and all other experiences is that when you show that you care and apply a victim-centered approach, you're humble, you listen, you build trust. And it is that actual trust that enables the collection of that evidence. Evidence collected from very innovative angles. And it is that evidence that is the most valuable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I will say, I think you've opened a whole new world to most of us, including myself, of what it actually means to apply the gender lens and where the synergies and the differences lie between, the way that different mechanisms conducted based on the context. I found your point about HRC access really, really interesting. I hope we'll have a chance to get back to that. Because of course, like you said, how can you build trust? How can you reach communities if you're unable to actually to be there physically? I do want to get to Marta for the next question, because we can bring in yet another investigative mechanism, the fact-finding mission on Venezuela. Marta, how have you applied the gender lens to the work of the FFM? And I'd also be interested in hearing how has your approach changed, or has it changed since the September 2020 mandate renewal, which now, of course, includes a specific reference to sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, this is an addition that, together with the 2-year mandate renewal, it was viewed as a great success. But I'm wondering, has there been a tangible benefit from including this gender language specifically in the mandate?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And it's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you. So thank you for the invitation. In the FFM's first year, while we did not have a specific reference to SGBV in our mandate, we have decided to apply a gender lens in our work. And that was through investigating and documenting acts of sexual and gender-based violence as acts of torture and other forms of ill treatment, which was specifically part of our mandate. And also by conducting a gender analysis of other human rights violations that were part of our mandate, such as arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial executions. And we have a dedicated specific chapter in our 2020 report to this analysis. In the FFM's second year, due to an extreme shortage of staff, we were forced to limit the focus of our investigations from what had been quite an ambitious plan to one particular issue, which was the responses of the justice system to the violations committed against government opponents. And we documented more cases of arbitrary detentions and torture and other ill treatment against this profile of individuals, which also included either a sexual or gender component. So very much in line with part of what we had already documented in the first year. Now this year, the second year of our second mandate with a specific reference to SGBV, as you mentioned, in spite of being faced with renewed staffing challenges, we are hoping to make use of our expanded mandate and document other forms of sexual and gender-based violence which go beyond what we have done in the previous 2 years, but about which I will not say much right now because we are just in the middle of conducting those investigations. So I'll be happy to discuss that once we are able to publish those findings and present them to the Council in September. Now, the specific inclusion of sexual and gender-based violence in the mandate of the Human Rights Council mechanisms is very important. However, or even more important than that is to have the necessary resources to investigate and analyze SGBV and other gender aspects. And more generally, to have sufficient resources in the team so as to allow investigations to cover different issues, including SGBV. In the first year, because there was no specific reference in our mandate to SGBV, we did not have a budgeted post for a gender advisor or SGBV investigator. However, and I want to highlight this, thanks to Justice Rapid Response and UN Women, we were able to have a dedicated staff member in charge of SGBV investigations and gender. And this was absolutely crucial to the work that the FFM was able to do in that first year and then in the second year. Well, in that first year, thanks to JRR and UN Women. Now, the fact that there was an inclusion specifically of SGBV in our mandate, in our second mandate, so for the second and third current year, one of the very tangible benefits of that was that this led to the creation of a budgeted post for a gender advisor who we now have in the team. So I go back to the point that I was making, that it is very important to have it to have a specific inclusion, I think, of SGBV and gender in the mandate, but this needs to be accompanied by the resources to conduct those investigations, but also more broadly in the team, so that actually we can also dedicate the resources that are meant to be working on these issues to actually work on these issues. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Marta, for that, and thanks for highlighting. It's a very concrete point that I think we oftentimes forget when advocating for the establishment or renewal of mechanisms, that there need to be sufficient resources to actually ensure that the posts are there, and that, you know, investigators are able to carry out the work that we mandate them to do. So this is a really, really great point, and I think something very concrete also that member states who are present here today can take away from this conversation. I do want to turn to Shahrazad next, because I do feel that sometimes, and both Julie and Marta elaborated on this, the way in which we as a wider international community understand the gender lens is very much through at first identifying it through, you know, sexual violence against women. What do you see as the limitations of current approaches to applying the gender lens? And of course, specifically with regards to the situation in Afghanistan. Thanks, Shahrazad.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and my thanks and gratitude to the hosts and my co-panelists. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. I think the situation in Afghanistan really presents us with unique challenges in utilizing UN Human Rights Council mechanisms overall and international human rights mechanisms. If the UN Human Rights Council mechanisms operate with an assumption that, part of the assumption at least, is that states are maybe neglectful or reluctant to advance gender equality, or in some cases there are violations of gender equality, or they might be, in some cases, perpetrators of gender violence. If that's the assumption, that's something that does not hold true in case of Afghanistan, because we currently in Afghanistan have de facto authorities that are actively implementing a gender apartheid. We have authorities who have de facto authorities who do not consider themselves committed to any international obligation, despite the Afghan state's obligations on gender equality. In fact, we have de facto authorities who do not consider women as equal citizens or equal human beings. And the arrival of these de facto authorities to power has meant that the whole national infrastructure, which could aid and assist and inform the international mechanisms about the situation of Afghanistan and assist in preventing and responding to atrocities, has fallen apart. Meaning that right now we don't have a legal framework, or there's ambiguity about what the legal framework is around protection of women from violence. We don't have the institutions that were put in place over the years for instance, protection of women from for protection of women victims of violence, be it domestic violence or violence committed in the context of conflict, as well as gender-based violence. So victims of gender-based violence as a whole, women, children, and men cannot seek any legal remedies in the current situation nationally. Additionally, documenting any form of atrocities causes huge risk to anyone in the country who is pursuing any documentation of human rights violations as a whole. In fact, it's considered a crime, or it's treated with, although there are no laws on this, but it's treated as a crime, reporting on violations, documenting atrocities, or sharing information about violations and atrocities with media, with UN mechanisms, could ultimately put someone's life at risk. So this is the environment in which, of course, deploying a gender lens and the gender approach becomes more important than ever, but also more complicated than ever. And it requires a lot of creativity. And I think part of that is this broadening our, as earlier speakers also remarked, broadening our engagement on a gender-based approach, broadening it from seeing women as victims to seeing women and women's rights activists, gender equality activists as agents. And because, again, in the context of Afghanistan, the groups that continue to push on the ground and outside for awareness of the gender apartheid and for deploying mechanisms to end the gender apartheid in Afghanistan are women's rights activists, both inside and outside the country. It's the protesters, it's the activists, it's the Afghan human rights community that's now mostly in diaspora. So in the absence of functioning national institutions such as Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, a national human rights institution on the ground, in the absence of a vibrant civil society on the ground because of the shrinking space, in the absence of free media reporting on atrocities, being able to work, Afghan local media, I mean, and lack of any possible or really shrink space for documentation on the ground, then I think there is for the UN mechanisms to be able to truly carry out their mandate on this regard, it's important to have a higher awareness of the human rights movement and Afghan women as activists, as bridges, and as a support system, a source of information. So where I have seen most impact is where I have seen special mandate holders or mechanisms actively engaging with Afghan civil society and Afghan women's rights activists and Afghan human rights organizations to complement their own knowledge and information and with the understanding that we cannot count on formal state mechanisms. For instance, prior to August 15 last year, we had several institutions within the state, within different parts of the government, providing reports on the human rights situation to the UN mechanisms. That's no longer the case. So the reliance has to shift in a way and more broadly focus on non-state actors in the sense of activists in the human rights movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahrazad, for that. And I'm really glad that you really mentioned and highlighted how, regardless of whatever happens in Geneva, we need to look at national institutions and the national infrastructure that if that is lacking, how that directly impacts the kind of response that we can see from the UN human rights system and the wider UN system. So thank you so much for that. That does bring me very smoothly to my next question for Reem, because it is part of your mandate to ensure that violence against women specifically is integrated in the UN human rights framework and its mechanisms. I'm wondering, what are best practices for institutionalizing a gender lens across Human Rights Council mechanisms and procedures, in your opinion?
Yeah, first of all, also thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's very timely. And first, let's look at the Human Rights Council and the important role that it has to play to mainstream women's rights and gender issues into the human rights system, including the issue of gender-based violence. And as we know, mainstreaming by definition means, of course, that it becomes deliberate, that it becomes a central and integral part of the work, and that it's not treated as an add-on or an afterthought to the work of the Council. So that would mean, by definition, that the Council would need to ensure that its resolution, that special procedures, mechanisms have a clear gender focus, and that they take into account how gender dynamics impact the enjoyment of all human rights by men and women in specific country situations. And we have seen actually that some of the resolutions of the Council were dedicated to central issues of gender equality and discrimination. So, for example, last year, the Council had adopted a landmark resolution on violence against women with disabilities. So that's very welcome. We also see that the Human Rights Council is sensitive to gender parity when it comes to experts and mandate holders. And if any of you had looked at the 2021 report of the Council, you may have noticed that more than 51% of the experts in the special procedures were women. And I personally feel this is important because, of course, women bring their own experiences as women into the human rights work and therefore influence the work of the Council. And I know that the Human Rights Council has, of course, put discussions on situations on the agenda that have very strong components of gender-based violence in them, like, for example, Afghanistan, as was mentioned, and Ethiopia. And also there are structures set in place to facilitate this work. So, for example, Canada and other member states have been leading the Women's Rights and Gender Issues Network, which can support the Council as a whole and member states in mainstreaming efforts. Now, when it comes to my own mandate, gender and GBV is written all over it. In fact, it's the raison d'être of the mandate. And as you know, there are also other mandates where gender-based violence is a core issue that they look at when exercising their work, like, for example, the SOGI expert, like the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, the Working Group on Discrimination, and others. But what I want to say is that other special procedures also do that. And in fact, when I first came on board, I had asked my colleagues to look at the reports of other mandate holders to see how they looked at gender-based violence. And I was very happy to see that other special procedures look at gender issues and violence against women where it arises systematically, whether it's in their thematic reports, whether it's in country visits, and also are very deliberate in including findings and recommendations on these issues. And you may have also noticed that as a mandate holder, I also try to join other mandates in engaging state and non-state actors. And that is a very deliberate decision because, of course, GBV is the worst form of discrimination and is exacerbated by other overlapping identities. So women, for example, that are indigenous or older women or disabled or human rights defenders might experience, stronger forms of violence because of these identities. And of course, collectively, we've called for perpetrators of violence to be prosecuted, to be held accountable, and also for victims to be assisted and protected. And holding others to account is, of course, not the only thing that is requested of us as mandate holders. And in fact, the resolution that renewed my mandate has specifically asked me to contribute also technical support and engage all relevant stakeholders, not just the human rights mechanisms, but really everyone working on the issue. And we have also commented on draft legislation and policies, including those that result in more gender inequality and discrimination and violence against women. And I and other colleagues, we participate in hearings by parliaments, by special commissions and other setups in order to actually make that point. Now, of course, it's important to realize that my mandate, like others, we all have limitations. We depend on the collaboration of states to put our recommendations and into practice, to also accept our findings, to accept to host us for country visits, and not to mention that also our capacities, though we cover the globe, some of us is also limited. So in that sense, we depend very much on our ability to raise attention about situations, and it's more of a soft power, so to speak, and the hope that by spotlighting attention on these issues and violations in a very public way, and in also reminding states and non-state actors of the responsibilities and advocating that we can advance the issue of human rights in one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Reem. And I think that your point about making sure that gender becomes an integral part of the work of the system, it speaks very well also to the point that Marta just made before about ensuring that there's enough resources and to really institutionalize it, to ensure that there's budget and there's the there's all the technical and logistical aspects in place to also carry out that mandate. So thank you so much for your point. I would like to expand the conversation now a little bit, because we've been, of course, discussing about work of the Human Rights Council mechanisms and procedures. But when we talk about applying the gender lens, we, of course, look at follow-up action that we want to see with that information that is collected. In an ideal scenario, investigations and reporting, of course, lead to accountability, including legal accountability. So, Patricia, if I may ask you, how does the inclusion of a gender mandate within Human Rights Council mechanisms and procedures and IIMM type bodies, such as from Myanmar, how does that impact proceedings at the International Criminal Court?
Right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the invitation and for the question. And I would like to extend my greetings to both the ambassadors from Liechtenstein and from Canada. Your question leads us really to a fundamental issue that many survivors and many relatives of persons who have not survived ask for justice after atrocities, whether they be human rights violations or whether they be international crimes. So I'm going to blend just a little bit when I'm referring to violations or crimes to understand that I could be talking about both of these legal regimes, international crimes, but also human rights violations. In terms of the Human Rights Council's very calling for commissions of inquiry, they could assist us, the International Criminal Court, but I would also add other international judicial mechanisms, just in the very composition of the teams. And when I say the composition of the teams, I mean to have a gender competent composition of the teams, from the commissioners through to the legal staff, through to the investigators, and any analysts. I emphasize this because to add gender in after the inquiry has been done rarely works, and it usually fails. And so we have to think of going forward when we're talking about the very composition of the team, but also the subject matter that the team will be asked to investigate. Do we leave gender out by the supposition, as has already been brought up by Shehrazad, that gender will only take place in a situation if there's sexual violence? If that is our forethought, then that means that we will be missing gender in 80% of the cases when the gender impact could have been non-sexual violence, or it could have been an impact of sexual violence of persons who are unfortunately deceased. So I would say selecting the subject matter, meaning the crimes or the violations, and then analyzing, understanding that you need a gender analysis while you are undertaking the investigation, not just at the end of the investigation, but while the investigation is going on. That means, who are we speaking to? Are we speaking to only males or only boys? Are we speaking to males and females? Are we speaking to all potential witnesses across the entire gender spectrum? I think Julie has already underscored this, but I would like to add several things. We have presumptions about potential witnesses. We have a presumption about, oh, the women will speak about sexual violence, or the girls will speak about sexual violence, and therefore we dare not ask the boy child soldiers. We dare not ask the generals or the politicians who have been receiving evidence possibly of gender-based crimes and sexual violence in their official communiques. I'd like to underscore this because I think Shehrazad was alluding to this. We cannot in any way expect politicians to be ignorant of sexual violence. They might be basing their very policies on sexual violence, or in the very least, on forms of gender discrimination. Therefore, having a type of prejudice against what type of information, what type of witness will give us, is actually a means of removing the gender analysis, even if you have at that point in time what you feel is a competent team. So the gender analysis during the investigation is important. Just as important is understanding the various types of gendered impacts that can arise from the violations and from the crimes. They might be direct and physical and psychological to survivors or to victims. They might be economic. They might be displacement impacts, such as women and children having to leave places, such as we see today in Ukraine, or they might be women and children having to take on burial rituals that usually belong to a masculine community. Understanding and having a gender analysis of the impacts is a way that we can arrive at the totality of the violations that have occurred and the possible reparations, non-repetition, and compensation that we could offer to victims and survivors. I would like to underscore another issue, and I think it's one that is too frequently overlooked when we have a gender analysis, is that we need to look at persons who are individuals, and we need to look at them within their collectivity. Within their collectivity could mean anything from their village, from their family, but in particularly under international criminal law, we should be looking at them as members of the civilian population, as members of various protected groups, whether they be prisoners of war, whether they be civilians who are detained, whether they be among the wounded, and of course, whether they be one of the genocide groups. Each of those groups are, by their very nature, have a gender composition. If we don't understand what happened in the different intersecting aspects of that gender composition of those various protected groups, we are not undertaking the mission of actually investigating and understanding the impact. If I could just also briefly say that when the commissions bring back their different reports, it is very exciting and thrilling to see a report that centers sexual and gender-based violence, or that centers some form of gender analysis. But I would like to say that those types of gender analysis should be present even in commission reports that on their face do not look as if they're gender oriented. When one is looking at, for example, the breakdown of social systems, hospital systems, education systems, they cannot be extracted from their gender analysis. So commissions of inquiry that are looking at supposedly non-gendered or supposedly non-sexual violence, they have to make sure that that team is just as gender competent as a team that goes out to explore outright sexual violence. Why is this important for the International Criminal Court or for judicial mechanisms? It is because from the very materials that the teams amass is how we might be able to identify victim leads, witness leads. It's how we might be able to understand what were the patterns of the violence, what were the patterns of the crimes. It is also how we can understand what was the gendered drivers of those patterns, of those crimes, and what was the manner in which, the gendered manner in which those violations took place. These are all types of pre-evidence, I would call them information until they're verified again, that we can amass from the reports. Another thing that is very important from the reports is that we often do not understand that the very people who are in the teams, they themselves might become potential witnesses. They might be able to explain to us not only who they have spoken to, those witnesses potentially might be deceased, but they can explain to us who they have not spoken to. And so that other leads might be followed up that just didn't fall within the remit of that current commission. At the same time, I believe that the investigators at the International Criminal Court or other judicial mechanisms have a means of understanding that certain commissions have certain mandates that might not include a broad aspect of gender. I think Marta very well showed that your first mandate might exclude sexual and gender-based violence, while your second mandate does include it. That does not mean, however, that information that has been gathered that has not been entered into the report might be very important in terms of the court or the Office of the Prosecutor's gender analysis. I think we all must understand that as much information that comes into a report, there is often information that is left out due to page limits, as benign as page limits, or as restricted as not approaching that issue at this time because certain verifications have not been done. I would also like to underscore that when we look at how the commission itself analyzes its report, the response from the Human Rights Commissions of the reports, that might also give the courts further information on what violations they might have seen that were overlooked or which ones were underscored. This too is valuable information, the reaction of the commissioners to the receipt of the report. That itself becomes information that can be used. I'm going to stop here and I'll follow up particularly later, or if there are any specific questions relating to the intersection of the international judicial mechanisms and the reports themselves. But what I do want to say is that what is very positive is that it is becoming a norm to have commissions of inquiry. It is very positive that they are some of the first verifiable facts from the United Nations point of view that international mechanisms have available to them and that they might use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's fascinating to hear your points on how really the gender lens needs to run through the entire investigation. And it does bring me back to Marta directly, because Marta, I'm wondering from the FFM's perspective, what does it mean to you to apply a gender lens to investigations more broadly? Also referring to what Patricia just alluded to. And I'm wondering, are there any challenges that you and your team face when you conduct gender analysis of possible atrocity crimes?
Thank you. Yes, so as I mentioned before, we applied a gender lens on the one hand by investigating sexual and gender-based violence. And as I mentioned, primarily because it wasn't mentioned specifically in our mandate, we looked at this type of violence as part of acts of torture and other ill treatment that were committed specifically in the context of arrests and detention, both following mass public demonstrations or as part of selective political repression. against opponents of the government. So this is as far as the investigation of sexual and gender-based violence is concerned. And I just want to highlight that point, that even though we did not have that specific reference in our first mandate, we were able to do a lot in this regard. So it doesn't have to be, an obstacle, as long as the members or commissioners have that present in their vision and interpretation of the mandate. And as I mentioned, as long as we have resources. Now, besides the investigation of sexual and gender-based violence, as I also mentioned, we applied a gender analysis to other different types of human rights violations and crimes that were mentioned in that first mandate we had. So what this means to conduct this gender analysis is analyzing not only how gender may have affected the selection of the victims of the various types of violations, but also how gender may have affected the manner in which those violations were committed. And as Patricia already mentioned, how gender influenced the impacts and harms caused by those violations. So, for example, in our first report, the mission documented how, in the context of arbitrary detentions, the conditions of detention impacted women differently, and how they faced additional risks, such as that of being, for example, coerced into sexual acts in exchange for access to basic goods or benefits. Also, in the context of extrajudicial executions committed in the framework of security operations undertaken mainly by police forces, we documented how, on the one hand, the victims of these executions were all men, because that corresponded to the profile being targeted of young male who were suspected of being involved in criminal activities. But also how the female relatives of these victims suffered other psychological and sometimes also physical harm while they were being forced to witness those extrajudicial executions, at times also being detained, removed from their homes and then detained, or how they were threatened, humiliated, and harassed when they searched for information or for justice for their loved ones. On top of the several financial strains imposed on them as a result of the executions of their male relatives and loved ones, which sometimes led to then increased economic vulnerability and additional risks as those persons, those women, searched for a better life elsewhere and tried to leave the country and were then at risk of trafficking and sexual exploitation or other forms of abuses. So this is something that we were able to document as part of, or as a result of having a gender lens and a gender analysis throughout the investigation of these other non-sexual forms of violations of human rights. Now, I also wanted to highlight that documenting gendered insults, threats, and other forms of harassment is an important and, interestingly enough, often overlooked part of highlighting the gender elements of various types of violations without a sexual component. Now, regarding your question as to the challenges, I think one of the main challenges in conducting gender analysis is to ensure, not only, as Patricia said, that it is done all throughout, but also that this gender lens is present in the minds of all investigators or all those collecting the information as they are collecting the information, or even when they are planning to interview. In other words, ensuring that the right questions are being asked and that you are looking for information in the right sources, which is a point that also Patricia had mentioned. And of course, this is a process that is facilitated when you have a dedicated staff member, a gender advisor or an SGBV investigator, who can help fellow investigators to incorporate those considerations into their investigation plan and into their interviews. And here, there's another challenge, which is in striking the right balance in having a person undertaking this very crucial function, while at the same time ensuring that the gender lens is applied by each person in the team. One additional challenge that I will mention, which goes back to a point that was made of access, we have found that to a large extent, our investigation was possible even without access to the country, and that this is thanks to the cooperation of civil society organizations that are incredible in their work and in their support to the work of fact-finding bodies, many of whom, by the way, are led by very strong and determined and dedicated women. But it is true that when for certain types of violations or violence rather that have a sexual component and that include a lot of or that are surrounded by a lot of stigma, of course that in-person interviews as opposed to the remote interviewing that we were forced to do because of COVID, I think is important. So I think access is definitely not, I would not say it's the major obstacle, but it is important to find these other forms of having access to the sources of information in a way that is conducive, of course, to collecting information about sexual and gender-based violence and other possible gender aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thanks for that and for highlighting on how the same type of violation does affect men and boys and women and girls differently, especially in the case of Venezuela, when you look at extrajudicial killings and the direct commission of the crime, but then also the way in which it affects relatives and families. That's something that's been really, really interesting and remarkable to see from your reporting. I do want to really stay on that question a little bit on the gender lens more broadly and get back to you, Julie, just because as a gender specialist and having been on so many different mechanisms, where do you believe that the UN human rights system is succeeding or failing in applying a gender lens to its mechanisms and procedures?
Thanks, Ellie. I think that there's already been a lot said here by also other panelists, so I'll keep it short here. There are many successes. Awareness is growing on the importance of applying a gender analysis to investigations. There's been amazing work done so far, and we have esteemed panelists here that also have highlighted this. However, investigating gross human rights violations and international crimes requires a different focus and lens. And a gender lens cannot be applied as an afterthought. Other panelists have also said that. If you want to apply a gender analysis at the end of the investigation, it's too late. It should be done from the outset, from the beginning, from when you plan your investigation, when you plan who you speak to, how you're going to speak to them, and where. So it's really has to be integrated from the outset to ensure you obtain evidence that reflects the harm, that reflects all the underlying acts of the crimes. And as I've mentioned before, it's not because you investigate sexual violence, and often the gender-based violence of the SGBV is forgotten in many of these investigations, but it's not because you investigate SGBV that you necessarily apply a gender lens. So too often you see gender lens subsumed in SGBV, and I think we really need to be careful of that. And so one way to avoid falling in that trap, it would be to maybe engage or encourage institutionalizing gender and intersectional analysis in internal policies, and encourage different human rights mechanisms and accountability mechanisms to share these policies among each other and learn from best practices.
Thanks for that, Julie. And those are great points, because I think as member states and also as civil society, we focus very, very much and we work very hard on getting mechanisms established. But it's interesting to look at, what needs to happen after, like, what happens next. And so these dynamics internally are really, really useful to understand. Patricia, I want to flip the coin a little bit here, because so far we've looked at how Human Rights Council action impacts follow-up proceedings in terms of prosecuting gender crimes, for example. I do want to change perspective and ask you how the inclusion of gender analysis has evolved under international criminal law, and to what extent can that inform the work of the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms and procedures?
Right, thank you. Well, of course, that could be a 2-hour seminar just in itself, but let me briefly say that the international criminal justice mechanisms, have certainly moved from identifying sexual violence, just rape, into understanding that sexual violence from the perpetrator's point of view has a function. And so we shouldn't just see it any longer as errant acts of one or two, a guard who is just out of line or a soldier who's out of line. The sexual violence carries a function almost to the extent at times one could say a policy. It's a policy of terrorization. When one understands how males are included in the sexual violence, in particularly males who in any way are detained, and how that sexual violence is somewhere public so that females are aware of it, the rest of society are aware of it, we understand that the function of the sexual violence goes way beyond the individual physical and psychological harm. And we have to also understand from the perpetrator's point of view of what he or his collective or her collective are trying to accomplish is that gender is something that every society is built upon. So the perpetrator's view of how they would like this gendered society to change, in particular, let's say in Afghanistan, or in particular, let's say when we're looking at situations of child soldiers, we understand that gender persecution or gender discrimination via certain acts, of course, can be understood almost as a norm because it is acting to reconstruct the society from the perpetrator or the violator's point of view. And let me just underscore one other thing. I think Mata has brought it out, but I also think Shahrazad is alluding to it, is that we have to understand that all crimes are gendered, in fact. So even if we're looking at torture, instead of saying, oh, well, that's not specifically sexual violence, we should understand torture per se is a gendered crime. I believe apartheid per se, even though we're looking at it from a racial dimension, when one looks in Afghanistan, apartheid is a gendered crime in the way that it's being enacted in Afghanistan by targeting the schooling of girls. I think we also have to understand that different forms of enslavement are driven by gender. When we look at the Yazidi situation, so the evolution of how we understand gender within atrocity crimes and violations has really, I think, expanded to almost normalizing it. It would be unthinkable that a perpetrator comes in gender neutral to do their atrocity crimes because they've come out of a gender perspective in their previous society and they're trying to recreate a harmful society in their own gendered image. So it is extremely contextualized at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Patricia. For that, I want to really continue that line of thought by going to Reem and see how, in your work as Special Rapporteur, but also in your previous roles with UNHCR and the ICC, you have witnessed the many ways in which women and girls are uniquely affected in atrocity situations. And Patricia has also just alluded, for example, to the case of the Yazidis, which unfortunately we haven't had time to touch upon so far. I'm wondering, what lessons have you learned through these roles on how Human Rights Council mechanisms and procedures can identify risk factors for crimes specifically affecting women?
Yeah, well, as others have mentioned, we know that women and others are targeted for gendered reasons, but also they experience violence in a gendered manner. And we know, therefore, that the women's bodies, their rights, their autonomy become almost always the first battleground and the first casualty when there is a regression in a human rights situation. And so legal changes in the protection and human rights regimes, particularly concerning women, we see restrictions in their freedom, we see rolling back of established rights and freedoms, even in countries where there is a strong rule of law, so to speak, and we see targeting of persons that belong to specific groups like GTBI, women journalists, human rights defenders, and other groups that might be at risk. Of course, and as you mentioned, since I was also a staff of the UNHCR, what UNHCR does, and which is also important and that others do, is to monitor, of course, the forced displacement situation and to see who is leaving a country and why. Because then we see that among these, there are also individuals and groups that are being persecuted because their lives are in danger because of generalized violence or targeted persecution, including based on gender. And it's important to keep track of that to understand, how their identity intersects with and with this persecution and how that determines the reasons that they are leaving. I also think that it requires us, therefore, to continue to look also at how protection systems are continuing to provide protection to persons fleeing gender-related persecution or not. And as you know, the 1951 Refugee Convention and its protocol allow and actually oblige states to provide protection to women and others fleeing gender-related persecution, and that's why it's important to continue to monitor that and ensure that's in place. And this is why, for example, a lot of us in the special procedures spend a lot of effort commenting, on the UK's Border and Nationality Bill, which precisely was threatening the legal basis for victims of trafficking, for victims of domestic violence and so on to seek and enjoy asylum in the UK. And since you asked me also about the ICC, let me just say that the ICC prosecutor, as some of you may know, has recently requested input to the process of updating their 2014 gender-related policy. And as part of the work we do in providing technical support, I mean, a number of us in the special procedures actually responded to that call. And a number of the issues that we sent to the prosecutor's office, essentially they mirror the points that Patricia has already raised. And some of them include a recommendation that the prosecutor's office, for example, defines gender in the revised policy in a non-binary way, and recognize also the rights and identity of non-binary person, and that there should be a clearer spelling out of the distinction between gender identity and sexuality, since they're not the same thing. And we also asked the ICC to underscore the intersectionality of gender-related discrimination and persecution. And we invited the court and the ICC prosecutor to also use the emerging jurisprudence from treaty bodies and Human Rights Council and special procedure in their work, and to analyze gender-related persecutions much more strongly through the lens of human rights. In terms of other ways to anticipate risks, I think we obviously have to continue to monitor and see how state and non-state actors are adopting more discriminatory actions and policies, or taking steps to eliminate discrimination, and also to see how basically in that also they do their due diligence obligations with regards to non-state actors. And if I may say, this is one of the remaining challenges, I think, when it comes to this work, because of course states are required not only to ensure that their officials and representatives do not engage in gender-based violence, but that they also take appropriate measures to prevent the infliction of violence by private actors, which also includes companies. And here, private actors, whether it's enterprises or private organizations, as we all know, can be very powerful. And in many cases, there is a nexus between a situation of violence, especially against groups of women or others, and businesses. And we see that, for example, in the case of extractive businesses and violence against indigenous women and girls. So we need to do more in order to develop jurisprudence on the issue of violence and against women and girls by private businesses. And I know this is an issue that The other special procedure, the working group on business and human rights is paying attention to and has even recommended, given that the UN guiding principles on business and human rights has a lot of gender-related elements in it. And they feel that we're obviously not there yet, and much more needs to be done there. The other point I would like to highlight is, of course, that we need to continue to monitor how new forms of violence evolve and how they appear in new spaces. And I think the best illustration of that is, of course, the serious problem we have with online violence, which is a phenomena that was not there when CEDAW was negotiated and adopted. So how we can continue to basically also address and respond to these new forms of violence where they arise, so that we ensure that the human rights standards in the online space is the same as in the physical space. And finally, as a final point, I'd like to say, and it's a point Shahrazad alluded to, but this all brings us back to the importance of continuing to be in touch actually with human rights actors and civil society organizations on the ground that are having a firsthand experience of all of this. And it really highlights the necessity to continue to support them in the work that they do and continue to call for their protection, since they face a lot of insecurities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reem, for really reflecting upon how different institutions look at this and how we can advance the gender lens throughout. I do want to get back to Shahrazad with a very concrete question on Afghanistan specifically, because of course, this whole discussion on the inclusion of a gender lens, it has been very, very prominent, and it was a very important discussion in September around the establishment of the Special Rapporteur mandate on Afghanistan. The mandate includes the integration of a gender perspective and a survivor-centered approach to its work. How should this mandate be interpreted, in your opinion?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think this whole discussion was very important for the mandate holder and the specific mandate holder, whoever they might be, because I think everyone brought a lot, especially on the gender lens. In terms of lessons learned and the issues to watch for, and how to integrate a gender lens from the start, and in the composition of the team, and also in the way the interactions with witnesses, with victims, and with actors in the government, outside government, are organized. I think for the mandate on Afghanistan, the special mandate, Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, it has to, the context, it has to come with the interpretation of the mandate has to come with the recognition of the context. Recognition of the fact that there is a gender apartheid in Afghanistan, and also recognition of the fact that there's a long-standing culture of impunity in Afghanistan. And the majority of Afghans, I would say, have been victims of conflict, and majority of Afghans have been victims or have been victimized by a diverse set of perpetrators, which include Taliban, but are not limited to Taliban. They include also international forces and the forces of former Afghan government, as well as, in addition to Taliban, other insurgent groups. The mandate is forward-looking, so it might be complicated when it comes to issues of accountability, looking at, for instance, allegations of abuse by international forces. But I do think that to the extent possible, the engagement of that mandate should not be limited to one set of survivors, for issues of credibility as well. That it shouldn't be just engaging with survivors of Taliban's atrocities or violations, but also try to bring to the fore and engage with survivors of crimes and abuses by other perpetrators as well, in an inclusive manner. So I think that's very important. It's also important that resourcing and staffing of the mandate, of course, as several esteemed panelists brought up. I think I understand that in the resourcing there is a position specifically focused on gender and a gender advisor. It's very important that also everyone who is working on the mandate has gender awareness and gender expertise, I think, really in the context of Afghanistan and with the current gender apartheid. It's just, it's going to be a very small team. So it should be one of the qualifications for everyone who is supporting that mandate in a technical capacity. I think in terms of analysis, the analysis and kind of the work that's being carried out, it's important to also include an analysis of the impact of the breakdown of the legal framework and legal institutions, and really making that and looking also through that lens, because this unique, this is a somewhat unique circumstance in Afghanistan where we had a complete scratching of the legal framework and institutions, particularly for protection of women, and what are the implications of that in terms of increasing violations and atrocities. And it's also really important, the issue of access. I think I saw in the questions also someone had asked, you know, how do we make sure that we hear the voice on the ground without putting them at risk? It's a huge question. It's difficult. It's more difficult, more challenging than ever. So thinking about methodologies, thinking about safety protocols that ensure that you have information from the ground with minimizing risk to people, but also really understanding the fact that people want to share information, right? This is, victims get in touch with me almost on a daily basis. People want to put out videos of violations and photos of violations on social media. And because there is an increased awareness and consciousness about human rights in Afghanistan, and Afghans want the international community to watch and to know what's going on. The protesters who are going on the streets to protest, despite the risks, will continue to protest and will continue to challenge the oppression. Our job is to try to listen to them and engage with them without putting them at further risk. But regardless of us listening or not, that's happening. People, you know, especially I think women's rights activists inside Afghanistan, their struggle is, which is why it's so inspiring. It's going despite all the oppression, all the threats, all the intimidation. So in terms of access, really thinking about methodologies and experiences, lessons learned from other contexts, similar contexts, to ensure that proper safety protocols are designed, but also especially that women are not excluded. I think there is a real risk because it's so much harder now than before to reach women in Afghanistan. There are no women in government institutions, and women are women are being excluded from the public space. You may also have to creatively think about how to engage the recent diaspora, and the fact that increasing, you have unfortunately, waves of refugees coming to neighboring countries. So the mandate may also have to look into interactions with refugees in a way to access some information that might not be accessible from inside Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahrazad. And I know we're running almost out of time, but I do want to leave the audience with some of your very personal, concrete recommendations for UN member states, but also the wider UN human rights system, how to further institutionalize the gender lens. And I know we've been talking about this throughout the entire event, but if there's one or two very specific recommendations that you would like to convene to the audience today, what would they be? I will perhaps just start with whoever is on my screen at the top left, and it happens to be Patricia.
Thank you very much. I think I would like to underscore that resources are fundamental, and that commissioner and team composition, and that the expectation is that there should be a gender analysis from the beginning to the end. We should not be surprised if we are lucky enough to have one. We should look at it as being incompetent if we do not have a gender analysis with the different commission reports. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Reem, would you like to go next?
agree with Patricia on the resources, and as highlighted, also better exchange and information sharing on the wealth of jurisprudence on gender-related issues that is out there among treaty bodies, special procedures, and others. And lastly, also support really civil society and human rights defenders on the ground that are really the ones that bring these things to the world's attention, basically.
Thank you so much, Julie. You're up next.
Yeah, so my points were already been mentioned, but just maybe to piggyback on what was just said, please continue funding women's grassroots organizations, LGBTQI organizations. They directly inform our policies and our operations, and they're also sources of information that are crucial to our investigations. Resources, yes, to all these gender analysis posts, I'm one of them, but also give us the resources to also deliver on our mandate and on our 2Rs. This means also please give us the funds to hire staff to help us with support services for witnesses, for protection to vulnerable witnesses. It's very difficult to abide by a gender-sensitive, victim-centered approach without a plural, holistic team. Practically, and this was not yet mentioned, this also means that we need service providers on the ground who deliver medical and psychosocial support to vulnerable witnesses. We often don't have access to these areas, but humanitarians do. Male survivors of sexual violence are sometimes left with nowhere to go for services because services are not responding to their needs. They don't want to queue in a refugee camp where women and girls queue for services. And so humanitarians, unfortunately, operating in these emergency contexts are reluctant, and I don't blame them, to engage with accountability mechanisms and human rights mechanisms, because it could be perceived as though their engagement can be infringing the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality. So there are many reasons that explain that. Of course, we need them on the ground. However, I think there are efforts that can be done by member states, by the UN system as a whole, to fill the gap and create trust between humanitarians and accountability mechanisms and human rights investigations, because we need to work together. Beneficiaries of humanitarians are also witnesses for us, or witnesses of crimes and survivors. And we need to engage together to collect the evidence and fight impunity.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that. Marta, would you like to go next?
Yes, so specifically addressed to Human Rights Council member states, obviously include the specific reference to SGBV and gender analysis in the mandates, but also when for some reason that is not done, I think it's important to have it clear on any guidance notes and materials produced to support the work of these mechanisms that this type of focus and gender analysis needs to be conducted. I've mentioned, and several other of the panelists have mentioned, resources. It's important, I think, for member states also to question and to keep abreast of how that process is going, of timely and proper recruitment of staff. So in our case, for example, it's OHCHR that has the task of staffing our fact-finding mission. And I think it's important that states are well aware and keep asking questions about that to those who have the obligation of staffing the mechanisms. Then I think also member states can and should include gender-related questions or comments in their interventions in interactive dialogues. And finally, I'll just mention that it would be wonderful if there are more opportunities of dialogue among mechanisms and procedures to share practices and recommendations, such as this opportunity now, and in that way support and enhance each other's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marta, for that. And Shahrazad.
Well, I think everything has been really said. I just want to emphasize again the point about a systematic approach to including the voices and the input and the analysis of local women's rights groups and grassroots human rights movements. Human rights councils interactions, of course, it's mostly about state-to-state interactions, but it should really integrate, better integrate the input and the insight and analysis that comes from local movements and local civil society actors.
Thank you so much. And I do apologize that we didn't have time to go into the questions from the audience. I will say that there are quite a few, but a lot of them, including from colleagues at the Permanent Mission of Spain and others, very much centered around exactly that question. What are some very tangible, concrete recommendations that member states can take on board in better integrating the gender lens? So we have come to an end of our discussion, and I really, really appreciate your time, and my apologies for going over a bit, but I really believe that you've left us all with a much better understanding of what the gender lens actually means when looking at atrocity situation, how we can become better at integrating it. I do want to thank one more time our co-hosts, Canada and Liechtenstein, and of course, most importantly, our exceptional panelists for taking the time to be here today. We will have a recording on the website shortly, and if you in the audience don't have time to re-listen to the entire conversation, let me just urge you to at least listen to that last bit and reflect upon very concrete, very tangible recommendations for member states, but also for all of us. Thank you so much once again, and have a wonderful rest